Welcome along, everyone. Hopefully, I'm live on Facebook and it's all working. As always, I can't watch myself trying to broadcast on Facebook. So, if anything is going wrong technically during this broadcast, please get on the comments and let me know. I'll greatly appreciate that because I have no idea if this is even going out. Right. So, today for this live broadcast, I want to follow the same format as previous occasions, and that is to do a 10-15 minute talk and then 10-15 minutes of question and answers afterwards. Get your comments and questions coming in, and I'll go through those at the end of the presentation. Just before I get into that, I wanted to sort of just remind you that if these sort of once a week sessions are not enough for you in underwater photography content, now on YouTube, Wetpixel have launched, but I'm a regular guest and contributor on it. A new sort of short form daily show, I guess for want of a better word, covering popular topics on underwater photography called Wetpixel Live. And sort of each show is based around a question, and rather like a Wetpixel forum, but in a live discussion forum, Adam and his guest, which is often me, discuss the details of that. So if you're interested in that, check out Wetpixel Live, which is available on YouTube. Right. So today's presentation is about motion, capturing movement in your underwater photos. And I think it's a really fascinating area for underwater photography, simply because it's a route into really interesting and imaginative underwater pictures. It really starts to take your pictures into a much more interpretive area and gives you a lot of room for personal expression, and as a result can create some real favorite images for a photographer. So I'm going to run through a slideshow on that now. So let me just bring my slideshow up. I need to sit myself a little bit more in the middle of my circle. So this talk is just some of the basics on capturing motion, capturing movement in your pictures. So let me just get my first slide. So capturing motion, I think, really suits the underwater world. It's a way of creating visually eye-catching images, but also in giving them a slightly more artistic, painterly, impressionistic feel to them. The combination of sharpness and blur within the frame makes them visually interesting, visually appealing, and can also solve us a few problems along the way, as we'll get to. What I want to do in today's talk is just run through some of the nuts and bolts about how we create these types of pictures. For me, for these pictures to work, they need to combine both really interesting textures, colors, and movement created by longer exposures and either camera movement or subject movement during the exposure, with real sharp details. I think if they lack the sharp details, they tend to not fulfill what the viewer wants. There's not enough reward for the viewer. So it's that combination of sharpness and blur that I think makes them very interesting. And typically that means we're combining ambient light exposure with flashlit exposure, the flash giving us an instantaneous light source that freezes motion, and then the longer exposure with the ambient light creating blur. We also create these shots with a continuous light combined with flashlight. Typically on night dives or black water dives, we can create blur with the continuous light source from our torch or flashlight, and our strobes or flash are freezing the action. But today I'm going to concentrate more on the ambient light situation. I think this is a great route into really, really eye-catching imagery. And this is one of my favorite sort of blur shots I've seen in the last few years. This is taken by Nick Moore, and he won the British Underwater Photographer of the Year title in this year's Underwater Photographer of the Year. So this is, like last week's topic of split levels, this is a great route to competition success. And actually, I think this technique has an additional advantage in that it tends to create very clean looking raw files, which all the motion blur and the camera movement tends to hide a lot of backscatter. It's still there, but the movement tends to hide it. So they're actually additionally suited to competitions, because any little specks that you might want to clean up actually tend not to show up too much in these types of images. So it's a very useful competition technique. Just while this picture's up, it reminds me that Nick Moore, who took this picture, has actually written a number of really nice articles on this technique recently. I think he deserves a lot of credit, not only for winning big with the pictures, but then being really open and honest and sharing his insights into what allowed him to sort of master this technique. I know there's a chapter in Martin Edge's new book about this by Nick. He's also written an article for Dive magazine on this, and I think on Dive Photo Guide. I'm sure Nick can jump in the comments when he sees this and give some more information on that. But I recommend checking them out because this is very much an overview type chat. So our route technically into creating these long exposure images is through shutter speed. We create that motion, we capture that motion by getting into shutter speeds that open up the possibility of blur. And typically that means slowing our shutter speed down from our normal shutter speeds. So the question that I'm always asked is, what shutter speed do I need to go to? And there isn't a single right answer, but there's definitely a sort of a hot range. We'll get into that on the next slides. Right. So this is an old-fashioned shutter speed dial. This is from a Nikonos RS, but cameras used to have shutter speed dials on the top. These days we typically do it through the menus, or sorry, through the control dials on the sides of the camera, seeing the numbers inside. But it's really when we get down below those normal values that we get into the realms of being able to capture motion. So for me, my sort of normal values for shooting underwater photography is from the synchronization speed of the flash. So, which is typically around a 250th of a second. Some cameras slightly faster, some cameras slightly slower than that, down to about a 30th of a second. And that's kind of my normal operating range as an underwater photographer. I might push that lower limit when taking normal pictures a little bit, but that's my normal sort of operating range. As I go into motion, it starts to going below that. So a little bit slower than a 30th, sort of a 30th down to a 15th. We will capture some movement in the subject. Depends a little bit on how fast the subject is going, a little bit how close to the camera it's going, and therefore how fast it's moving relative to the lens. If my hand is doing like that, it blurs very quickly in front of the lens. Back here, that same movement is not so easily blurred. And also that slow, and then any subjects that are moving really, really fast will still blur at these range. But generally, if we want to get that the blur coming into our pictures, we need to get our shutter speed slower than a 15th. So for me, that 15th of a second is the gateway into this type of creating motion, creating blur in our pictures in underwater photography. So it's a good number to hold in your head. Now, the other factor that, I shouldn't need to say, but I know from teaching this, I do need to say a lot, is you need to go to these shutter speeds while still maintaining the correct ambient light exposure. If you just simply go from your normal settings and slow your shutter speed way down, your background is just going to get brighter and brighter and brighter. Instead of being nice blue of the ocean, it becomes bright white and everything's obliterated. So in addition to slowing the shutter speed down, you're going to need to adjust both your ISO down or your aperture more closed to compensate for the fact that you're now leaving the shutter open for longer. So while I'm saying go to these slow shutter speeds, it's about going to these slow shutter speeds while still maintaining the correct exposure on the blue. And I think that can be sometimes quite hard because when you go to these really long exposures, you then need to get your ISO very low to create to hold a good blue, or shut your aperture way down. And then you can often need really quite a lot of strobe power. So I think one of the key things for doing this type of photography is to choose the right conditions to do it in. If you wait for those correct conditions, when it's maybe a little bit darker, a little bit overcast, a little bit deeper, later in the day or something like that, those things can all help us get into this range without having to go to really extreme low ISOs or really shut apertures, which make it all a lot easier. So for me, the prime range of shutter speeds to be getting these blurs is somewhere slower than a 15th of a second down to about a quarter of a second. The reason I generally don't like to go slower than this is when you go to the really slow speeds, so down below a quarter of a second, yes, you get lots and lots of blur, but it becomes very uncontrollable. You're really not really sure what you're going to get in terms of the picture. A lot can happen in that time to give you very unusual and very unpredictable effects. Now, sometimes that can be a good thing because it can create something you really weren't expecting. And I think part of the attraction of this technique is it does give you, each picture is different. And, if you take a number of them, you can end up with some really interesting effects. However, that prime range of a 15th down to about a quarter is just a really good working range. The slower you go, the more movement you get, but the less control you have over exactly what's going on in the picture. So don't forget to get comments and questions coming in for me to cover after this presentation. If there aren't too many, then obviously I'll just wind it up straight away, but hopefully we can do about 10 minutes of questions afterwards. So get your thinking caps on. Right, so I just wanted to show a few pictures to show that actually although I'm talking about that 15th of a second being a gateway, If your subjects are going really, really fast, as this pair of spawning surgeonfish were, actually here there's loads and loads of subject blur in this picture, even though I shot this at a 50th of a second. And that's simply because these fish were swimming as fast as they could. And I flukily caught them in focus. But typically we want to get down into that prime range. So this picture here, it's a zoom blur picture, but it's still a motion capturing picture. It's shot on about a 13th of a second. And that's kind of right in the heart of that really nice range of giving good controllability, but also plenty of time to capture blur, capture some interesting effects in our pictures. But sometimes we can go really slow and get good results or very creative results. The picture of the blenny on the left there, I took that last week, and that's taken on a 1 second exposure just to burn that background in, create some texture. I wiggled the camera a little bit during the exposure just to blur the detail out rather than getting too many obvious ghosting effects. But generally, I wasn't trying to create a lot of movement. I was just trying to create interesting textures with a long exposure. The picture of the octopus on the right in its shell, that's a long exposure at night, and the trails around that were created by plankton moving in the torch beam in this case during the exposure. But both of particularly the octopus one, was a very unpredictable shot. I really didn't have a clear idea of exactly how most of that frame would look when I was taking the picture. So the big question I sort of want to finish off with is front or rear curtain sync. Now, this is a slightly more technical area, and I don't want to get too technical in this talk today. But in simple terms, when you take a picture with flash, with a camera, the flash can be fired by the camera either at the start of the exposure or the end of the exposure. The front of the exposure or the rear of the exposure, the first curtain of the exposure or the second curtain of the exposure. Doesn't matter quite about what the terminology is, but it does knowing whether it's front or rear is important for your camera. And the thing I always forget to tell people when I talk about this is that your front curtain, first curtain, that is your camera's default. And a lot of people assume that all these pictures are taken with rear curtain sync. And for me, I tend to use front curtain more than rear, but I use rear quite a lot. And I think it's a mistake to think either is better than the other. So for me, the basic rule I divide it on is if I'm keeping the camera stationary, I shoot on rear curtain. And if I'm moving the camera, I shoot on front curtain synchronization. So the flash is going at the beginning of the exposure when I'm moving the camera. If I'm keeping the camera still, I'm shooting on rear curtain. This picture here, you can tell from the background that I was intending to keep the camera still. And this is a long exposure, and what it allowed me to do is it allowed me to capture the movement of the fish. You can particularly see it in the silver sides above the main tarpon there. They've kind of created these spaghetti-like trails, and then the fish are frozen at the end of that movement. So the flash has gone at the end of the exposure, the rear part of the exposure. So this is a rear curtain sync shot. Now, actually, this is just a slide to remind me to say that cameras are typically set up as a default to be front curtain sync, and you need to turn the camera to rear curtain sync to make use of this. I'm just going to move my head because it's actually in the wrong place showing this shot. So one of the reasons that actually, although the default is front curtain sync, I tend to use when I'm shooting wide angle, and typically when I shoot wide angle, I hold the camera still. I like to have my camera set onto rear curtain sync for that. And not every camera allows this with every strobe, but most cameras do with most strobes. There are a few that don't. If you fire with front curtain sync, the flash goes at the beginning of the exposure. And then if you're keeping the camera still and the subject moves, it creates a ghost shadow or shape through the picture. And because that subject has moved across the frame after your picture, that ghosting shadow goes out in front of the subject, and it makes the subject look a little bit like it's swimming backwards. So this shark here is a mistake shot. It's a picture taken on front curtain flash during only a 30th of a second, but because the shark was going quite fast, you can see there's quite a strong shadow off the nose of the shark. Now, that shadow doesn't ruin the shot, but had I used rear curtain sync for this picture, that shadow wouldn't be there. The shadow would be off the tail of the shark and it wouldn't be visible in the picture. So as a standard situation, I will preferentially set my camera to rear curtain sync. I just forgot to when taking this picture 10, 11 years ago. Okay, next slide. This is a good example. So I like to use rear curtain sync to capture the movement of a subject so the subjects can swim through the frame in any direction they choose, and then I freeze them at the end of the exposure. So this picture here I just took to demonstrate rear curtain sync. It's just some tetras swimming around at the end of a cave dive in the cenotes in Mexico. And what you can see here is that I've opened my shutter, I've taken my picture. The fish, the tetras, have swum through the picture and they're swimming in from both sides, of the frame. And then at the end of the exposure, the flash has gone and frozen them. And that way, the trails from the fish come out behind them and they look like they're moving in the right direction. This is another example of rear curtain sync for capturing movement. And here I wanted the jetty and the lights of the jetty in the background of this picture to not get blurred by camera movement. So I chose here to use rear curtain sync so that I could keep the camera stationary. And then I used a long exposure to allow the fish to move through my frame and create blur trails, freezing them at the end of the picture. Now, the downside of this technique is I didn't know exactly where all those fish would be, but there were kind of enough of them in there that I was fairly confident that I'd have still quite a nice picture. But more typically, I like to use front curtain sync for these types of pictures. And it has sort of two advantages, really. The first is that the flash goes right as soon as you press the shutter. So you get exactly the composition you want and you freeze the subject at that point. Now, if you don't move the camera, it'll look like your subject is swimming backwards. So then you need to move your camera, typically in the same direction the subject is moving, but faster than the subject. And in my book, I called it accelerated panning, but you're basically accelerating past the subject when you shoot. The good thing about this is because you're moving the camera a lot, that movement generates additional blur. So you get a really strong effect without having to go to really slow shutter speeds. So you get lots of motion blur, lots of interesting textures, and it creates really nice effects relatively easily. So for me, the thing I remember is if I'm planning to move the camera during the exposure to create blur, in this case, to create streaks from the textures on the sand, I'm going to use front curtain sync. So I framed up this seahorse as it was you see it in the frame here. I press my shutter, and then after I press the shutter, while the shutter was still open of the camera, it was still open, I'm then panning the camera across the picture faster than the seahorse. That way the blur of the seahorse goes backwards and it looks like the seahorse is moving forwards. The blur doesn't then go off the face as well, which is nice. And it allows me to create a nice blurring effect on the seabed. I also use this front curtain sync approach for doing spin shots and for doing zoom blur shots. I've got one of each to show you, so that I can precisely frame my picture when the flash goes at the beginning of the exposure and then create the blur after the flash is fired. So it allows me to get exactly the composition I want. With zoom blur pictures, I typically like to zoom wide to tight when shooting these pictures. So I'll get as close as I possibly can to the subject, flashlight it wide, and then zoom in, and then that creates an exploding zoom as the subject basically gets larger in the picture. And so you've got the subject shot like this, and then the zoom goes out from it. If you zoom tight to wide, you can fill the frame with the subject, but then the zoom lines go into the subject. So in some cases you might want to use that, but typically we zoom from wide to tight so the subject grows in the picture and the blur goes out from the original subject captured with flash. And that is my time up. So hopefully that's given you a little bit of an insight. I'm going to switch back to my main camera and pull up some comments. So fire in some questions and comments, and I'll run through these if I can make them work. Hey, Kathy, nice for you to be here. I'm glad I found a time that you're not working or you're skiving off work. Hi, Andy. Hi, Mark. Thanks for joining in. Hi, Pam. I'm just going to whiz down through these. Hi, Pete. Hi, Jill. Oh, stormy Cayman. Well, it's a little bit stormy here. I think we're about to have a bit of storm. Hi, Oscar. It's really nice to see everyone from around the world. I have to say, in these times when we can't get out and about and around the world quite as easily as we used to be able to, it is really nice to be joined. It's good. It makes me feel nice anyway, being joined by people from all around the world. Hi, Ivan. You have a shortcut in your menu. I don't use a shortcut. I have to press my flash button, which on my D5 camera is on top of the camera, and on my D850, which is here actually, is on the back of the camera here, which I press through the housing and then change the flash menu. A lot of people press the info button first on the camera so that they get the screen up and they can see what they're doing. I just tilt my camera back so I can see the flash menu through the top window of my housing. But I don't have a shortcut. I don't tend to change between them that quickly. I do change it quite a lot, but it tends to be right. I'm now going to do a sequence of shots in this style okay, I finished that, go back to the other way of shooting. And I have to say, sometimes I do forget and have it in the wrong mode. Have you ever tried multiple flashes to create movement? Well, I think Justin is teasing me here because I had a problem with my camera the other day where my flash gun was firing multiple times during my exposure. So accidentally, yes, I have, but I haven't tried shots of capturing that. Actually, to get sidetracked on that, it was something that I was actually, the new retro flashes have a user controllable menu. And it was something I was thinking about asking Retro to put in, is a strobe mode, so that you can set the flash to fire multiple times from a single sync in one of the user modes. And I talked about that in one of the reviews I wrote about it early on. So I do think it's really interesting. Not when you don't want it, but I think if you've got a subject against open water, the chance to flash it several times during one exposure would be really interesting. Hi, this is from Jessica. Hi, Alex. I've been having a hard time keeping the subject sharp. Any tips? Also, when doing 1 second's exposures, the camera still handheld. Yes. So first of all, don't be too worried about going with really long exposures, as long as you're getting plenty of flash on the subject. The flash on the subject will keep the subject sharp, and as long as you're correctly exposing the background with the 1 second exposure, it won't overwhelm the subject, and it will just create lots of nice, pretty movement. So don't worry about the exposure time too much. Personally, I wouldn't go as long as 1 second most of the time, but if you need to, you need to. It generally puts things a little bit too much out of your control. In terms of keeping the subject sharp, the key to that is to get lots of flash on it. And I guess a smaller point is if your subject is super bright compared to the water, say you're photographing a bright white sponge and the water is really dark, then you'll get loads of ghosting off that sponge. So you don't want to do this technique with a super, super bright subject, because that's, in terms of the ambient light, is going to create a lot of effect. A nice red subject works really well because it's nice and dark in ambient light, and then when you put the flash on it, it really pops. So that could also be a reason why you're not getting sharpness. Right, how am I doing for time? Okay, a few more minutes. Right. Gerard, hi Alex. What to do if your camera strobe combination does not allow rear curtain sync? That is a harder one. One thing that can really come to your rescue on this is that increasingly now, a lot of the flash trigger boards that you can buy for the housings have got this in. And I've moaned in the past how I don't feel they're very helpful because they're all focused around TTL. But the features that do really excite me are the ability to do rear curtain sync with them, and the ability to do high-speed sync now, which is possible with some flash guns. So have a look at seeing if you can get a different flash trigger or different trigger board inside the housing. That can give you that accessibility. The only other alternative is if it's a Canon housing, a Canon camera, is to house a Canon flash gun with all 6 pins connected with an electronic cord, which is a little bit limiting for this sort of thing. I do also think that CCAM have it in their flashes for Canon. I have a Nikon, so I don't know. I have the CCAM flashes, but they don't have any of that circuitry in. Yeah, thank you, Swanee Swan. I think one of the things I really wanted to say at the beginning is, the world is constantly in motion, and still photography is all about freezing it. But actually, I think still photography becomes especially interesting when we start to capture this motion and movement in it. Joe, there's no newbie questions here, so don't worry about that. Mike for the Thirds has second option. Is that the same? Exactly the same. I was speaking Nikon language, but I did try and say second curtain as well. Yes, it's exactly that. It's the non-default, and it opens this up to you. One thing to watch when using second curtain flash is you want to get your pre-flashes off. Otherwise, you get an annoying flash at the beginning of the picture, which can sometimes scare the subject before that final end of flash. It doesn't show up in the picture because it's a pre-flash, it's before the exposure. But it can sometimes spook the subject before maybe half a second later your second curtain flash fires. So if you are using pre-flashes, I'd get them turned off if you're able to. Hi, Marty. Thank you for being along. Thank you, Martine. Thank you, Renee. All right, there's another question here from Swanee Swan. Thank you for the video. If budget isn't an issue and you're looking for a great underwater lens for your Sony a7 III, would you suggest the 12 to 24 or the 16 to 35? Now, I have not shot the Sony A7s underwater, so I don't have any specific knowledge of those two lenses. However, my general feeling is I've yet to see a 12 to 24 that outperforms a 16-35 underwater. So my gut feeling was actually the narrower lens is maybe a better option there, but I have to say I'm not sure which one is the better option. For me, if money was no object, I would definitely be looking quite seriously at the Nauticam WACP1 to cover that zoom range. It's the best optic to use in that situation, and it's certainly the one I use to cover that zoom range on my Nikon cameras. And you can, I'm sure, adapt it. I know you can adapt it to work with the Sonys very easily. So that might be another option to use. And although it's made by Nauticam, you can mount it onto any brand of housing pretty easily because it's just a normal port, really. And it's a great. Oh dear, I've shrunk my comments. I'm never going to get that back. Right, let's get on to some more comments. Hi, Yildirim. Oh yeah, it looks like you're Turkish from your name. I'm sorry if you're not. But yeah, I'm probably pronouncing your name very horribly. Gustavo, thank you. Hi from Mexico. This is really nice having people from all around the world. Mike joining us from Bali. Right, Jill, do you have a preset in your camera to allow a quick change from front to rear curtain? Ivan asked the same question. I presume you can set it to do that on your camera, but actually for me, it's more about I'll change over for a series of shots. So it's not normally something I necessarily am doing in the heat of the battle. I'm like, right, now I'm going to take this type of image. So I'll quite happily change over at that point. It's not really a time critical one. If you were going to do a lot of this, you could set it as a preset, but I don't have it set as one. Hi Chip, with zoom shots, do you recommend front or rear curtain sync? So I like with zoom shots to have the flash to go at the beginning of the exposure. That way you know the subject is in focus when you press the shutter, when the flash is going to go off, and you know it's framed exactly as you want it. And then I'll zoom during the exposure to create interesting effects. One thing I didn't cover in the talk is if you zoom and twist at the same time, you get a spiral, which is quite cool. And I've never seen anyone, I did have a shot in, but my talk was too long already. But I've never seen anyone do a really nice shot like that underwater. So if you zoom the lens and rotate the camera at the same time, you get the combination of the zoom and the zoom and the spin, and it becomes a spiral, which can look really cool. And I'm waiting for someone to do a really good underwater shot using that technique. Thank you, Shala. Hi, Nedad from Croatia. Hi, Karen from Austin. Hope it's not too hot. Thanks. Doing most gives great information. Thanks. Yeah, no, I mean, it's a really nice technique to have as part of your portfolio as an underwater photographer. So I'd encourage everyone to do it. Right. There's another question here. I'm not reading all these out because I'm nearly out of time. Which focus mode when doing these types of shots? Typically with front curtain sync, you can use your normal focus mode because you can trust the camera because the camera is in focus when you press the shutter and the flash is going straight away. So in that case, it's fine. If you're doing a really long exposure with rear curtain sync, you might want to use a fixed focus, either using a back button focus when you're not pressing the button at the time, or turning the autofocus onto manual focus when you know it's roughly in subject. Because these are typically wide angle pictures, it's less of an issue. But yeah, I use normal focusing when it's front curtain sync. Rear curtain sync, if I'm going really long on the exposure, I might think about what I'm using so that there's no potential for confusion during the picture. That said, the lens, once the shutter is up, I don't think the lens is going to refocus anyway. So it's probably fine anyway, thinking about it. But if you're struggling with focus, then I would think about using a fixed focus. But just be aware when you're doing your panning not to be going backwards and forwards and changing your camera to subject distance. I posted a memory of a flooded strobe. Strobe flooded just between dives one day. I think one thing, for me, the Inon Z240 was, or Z240 as you guys call it over there, Mark, was the most reliable underwater flash ever produced. They've been unbelievable servants to underwater photography for years and years and years. And I just think a lot of them are getting pretty old now. And I think, that flash gun completely recalibrated what we expected in terms of reliability from underwater flash guns. So yeah, that one particular individual one eventually flashed, but it was easy to get fixed. How do you spin the camera and keep the subject in the frame? Well, if your flash goes at the beginning, hi Russ, at the beginning of the exposure, then what matters actually is that the subject stays in the frame at the beginning. If it ends up out of the frame, it doesn't matter so much. So as long as the flash is going on that front curtain, first curtain at the beginning of the exposure, then actually if it ends up out of the picture, it doesn't actually affect that look because you've got the sharpness of the subject in the picture. And then wherever the camera ends up making the blur isn't so critical. Right, I'm going to whiz through the last couple of these. I'm down to my last minute. Thanks, Shruti. So zoom blur front curtain. Yes, I generally, yes. Yes. Zoom blur can also be quite nice as an available light technique as well, which can be quite cool. It's then blurry all the way through. Thanks. Okay. Sean asking, do I ever use Sony cameras? I've only shot one once underwater, so it's an area where my knowledge is pretty thin. But I really like them. I just haven't had, I'm typically using my own cameras. Best lens for zoom blurs. Well, it's got to be a zoom lens. So the one I showed in the talk was shot with a Tokina 10-17. 1635s can work pretty well. Generally those. I've never tried a zoom blur with the 8-15 circle to full frame fisheyes. So I'm not sure how they would work. I don't think very, very effectively. But generally any zoom lens is a pretty good option. I know people have done them with even the macro zoom lenses, but I never have tried that underwater. Thanks. Okay. Thanks, Dean. Sorry I didn't get to see you during the week when we were diving. I'm going to wind this up now. Thank you, everyone, very much for tuning in and watching. And thank you very much for the questions. I'll attempt to do one of these each week. So sort of tail end of next week, hopefully I'll have another topic. If anyone has any suggestions for topics, keep them coming in, because actually I'd much rather be answering your questions than picking something for me to talk about myself. So cheerio. Bye, everyone.